Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we're back with another innovator interview. Today we're going to talk with George Leonard, who's the chief scientist for the nonprofit Ocean Conservancy, about the state of the oceans, plastic pollution, and in particular, the impact of COVID-19 personal protective equipment, or PPE, pollution on the oceans and waterways. The organization recently completed its annual survey of beaches and waterways, during which it found 107,219 items of PPE. That's masks, shields, gloves, and other things. Now, that was just a sample around the world of what they discovered. So a massive increase in PPE pollution during the pandemic. Unfortunately, we seem to treat the oceans as a dumping ground, but the seas are a source of food and much of the world's oxygen. And according to the United Nations, global fisheries could collapse by 2048. So there's a lot to talk about. George, welcome to the show. How are you today?
It's great to be here, Mitch. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you for joining us. Let me just ask a kind of a broad, straightforward question. What's the state of the oceans today?
That's a big question. I would say the state of the oceans is struggling. There are continuing threats to the ocean that in many cases seem to be accelerating. Mm-hmm. And these really fall into three broad categories. So this is kind of global overexploitation, overfishing, catching too many fish, mm-hmm. climate change, which is really a long-term existential threat to the ocean, which is really driving increases in acidity and increases in temperature in the ocean, which is having impacts throughout the marine food web. And plastic pollution, which is the number three, it's one of the top three threats to ocean health and was really a sleeper issue 10 or 15 years ago and has now really emerged as a major concern that we need to do something about.
Well, plastic waste is a pandemic from the ocean's perspective. And we estimate, or we should say that a number of scientists have estimated that in a couple of decades, there's going to be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish and animals. So tell us about what you found in the recent survey. How much has PPE pollution added to the problem?
Well, it's pretty clear from this new report that Ocean Conservancy has put out that, we have a huge plastic problem in the ocean. And the pandemic is really making that worse. And I think the PPE example is a bit of an object lesson in our reliance on plastics. Every September, Ocean Conservancy for over 35 years has organized the International Coastal Cleanup, and this has become the biggest volunteer effort on behalf of the oceans anywhere, and people around the world turn out to clean up their local beach and their local waterways. The year before the pandemic, nearly 1 million people came out. It was a huge year for us. Obviously, the pandemic sort of shut things down. We had about a third of the normal effort in terms of volunteers. We encouraged people to go out in socially distanced and small groups. Mm-hmm. But what was really quite striking is we found a lot of PPE. So we found, as you said, over 107 items in 70 countries and states around the world. In particular, masks were pretty much everywhere. Right. And while we don't have a good quantitative estimate of how big the iceberg is, we're pretty sure that really is just the tip of the iceberg.
So a third of the people found the number that was in the information was about a 300% increase in PPE just over the course of a few months. And that's remarkable. I mean, it just shows how thoughtless we can be about the oceans. Now, these items shed microplastics. Tell us about what happens with the fibers, for instance, that are shed by a mask.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different products and a lot of different plastics that can find their way into the ocean. We've often heard about Coke bottles and plastic bags, which are major concerns in the ocean. But PPE is also made of plastic. Fabrics are made from a variety of synthetic fibers. And those can shed into the environment. So there was a recent study that just came out recently that suggested that something like 173,000 fibers can be shed daily from a single single-use plastic face masks. So, that in some respects, that's not surprising given what we know about shedding rates in other textiles. But it is a testament to the fact that these things can break down into their microfibers. And of course, those are small enough that you can't see them, but they can get into the base of the food web through filter feeders and small fish.
Now, as a result, we know that those microfibers are also in us because we've eaten those fish. What are the short-term risks to wildlife from, say, for instance, a mask that has been discarded and still has the loop on it, or a glove that might get stuck on an animal?
Yeah, so the microfiber shedding issue is one component of the threat of single-use PPE in the marine environment, but the other is the physical interaction of the full item. And you've identified sort of two of those issues. One is entanglement, and the other could be ingestion. So we know, for example, with sea turtles, that jellyfish are one of their dominant prey. And we know that sea turtles can often mistake plastic bags for jellyfish, and this has been well documented. And so there's good reason to believe that things like plastics gloves, which sort of look the same in the marine environment, could also be an ingestion hazard for species like sea turtles. But masks also, of course, have ear loops on them, and there is concern that those essentially could entangle birds and invertebrates and other species. And this has now been sort of documented anecdotally in the media and other cases. So there's good reason to believe that face masks in particular can be an entanglement hazard. And that's why we always encourage folks, if they do use disposable PEPP, to kind of cut those ear loops before you dispose of them, so that that won't be a threat if they end up in the environment.
Yeah, so a simple step could make a big difference to an animal or a bird. But just tear that loop off before you drop it. But please don't drop it. I mean, that's the problem, is we're trying to facilitate littering here in a safe way.
Well, look, let's be really clear. Littering is always bad personal behavior, but it's especially bad during the pandemic associated with PPE. The World Health Organization considers these materials to be potentially infectious waste, and they should be treated as such. So, it's one thing to drop a Coke bottle in the parking lot. It's another thing to, casually dispose of personal protective equipment that might be covered with the coronavirus. So really responsible behavior by the individual is really critical.
Now, let's widen the view a little bit and talk about just fighting plastic pollutions in the oceans generally. Sure. Now, we know that more than half of the plastic in the ocean is fishing nets and other forms of fishing waste. Are the consumer campaigns that we're doing around straws and other things really making a positive impact, or should we be switching to targeting the entire fishing industry to reduce their waste?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the plastic pollution problem in the ocean is multifaceted, right? So we know that consumer plastics, the kinds of things that end up on Ocean Conservancy's top 10 list through the International Coastal Cleanup, are a big part of the problem. So these are things like food wrappers, bottles, caps, bags, etc. But that's really not, that's not the only problem. There are other ways. There are at least two other major ways that plastics are finding their way into the ocean. So one is the microfiber issue, which we touched on earlier, related to textiles and often a washing of textiles beyond PPE proper. But the other, as you said, is fishing nets. And we really have pretty poor data about the prevalence and the magnitude of how much fishing gear is lost in the ocean. The current figure, which is outdated and scientists are currently working on, is about 680,000 tons are lost every year. But we know it is a major source. And of course, fishing nets are designed to capture and kill fish. So when they're lost in the ocean and float around, they can become ghost nets and a real direct threat to many fish and seabirds. And then when they break down, they create these microfibers we were talking about before. So interestingly, you ask about should we focus on that? In fact, Ocean Conservancy has a program which we call the Triple GI, which stands for Global Ghost Gear Initiative. which is designed to get at this very problem. It is an international group of conservation organizations, scientists, and importantly, the fishing industry that are working to identify best practices to minimize the loss of gear and to work on recovering gear that's lost in the ocean to get it out of there to reduce the threats.
Do you get the impression that the fishing industry understands the danger they are putting themselves in simply by being so casual about discarding their gear in the ocean?
Well, I think the industry is definitely aware of this problem. I mean, we have really strong enthusiasm from the industry to join the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. And I do think it's important to recognize here that there are not a lot of fishermen and fisheries that are sort of casually discarding nets. These things cost a lot of money, and nobody wants to throw money literally into the ocean. But there are cases in which they get hung up or they become a hazard to the vessel and they end up getting discarded that way. There is a whole subset of fisheries called IUU fisheries. These are illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries.
Okay.
And these are essentially pirate fisheries in the high seas.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes they will discard gear when they're trying to basically outrun the authorities. So that's a different set of behavior. But in general, there's really, I think everybody's on the same page here. That we don't want gear in the ocean and that we all have a shared objective to minimize loss and to increase recovery.
That's interesting perspective, particularly since I recently watched Seaspiracy, which really was a damning representation of the fishing industry. What would you say what does the Ocean Conservancy recommend society do generally to reduce plastic pollution?
So just to comment on Cspiricy, as you referenced, that has received a lot of attention, both by conservation organizations, but also well-respected scientists around the world. And I think while the film identifies some specific aspects of global fishing that is indeed deeply troubling, it's a gross oversimplification and often really misuses information in a way that is not scientifically accurate. And it implies that all fisheries are unsustainable and that the only solution to that is to stop eating fish entirely. And at Ocean Conservancy and many of my conservation colleagues, we really fundamentally disagree with that conclusion. In fact, there are a lot of unsustainable fisheries, that's for sure, but there are many that are sustainable. And in fact, what we should be doing is identifying, recognizing, and promoting those sustainable fisheries and reducing the unsustainable ones. And so there's lots of good examples, including here in the United States, where that very effort to do that has resulted in improvements in the ocean and more fish in the sea, and yet more fish on people's plates as well.
I want to talk a little about sustainable fishing in just a moment, but can we just generally, what does the Ocean Conservancy suggest people do to reduce the plastic pollution problem that they might be contributing to?
Yeah, so to solve the pollution problem in the ocean is going to require kind of a range of strategies. So there's no sort of single strategy. There's no silver bullet here that is going to resolve this issue. We think this involves both individual behavior, but it involves policy and systems change, and in particular, corporate responsibility. So the individual choices that people make really make a difference. So this is, kind of using a recyclable coffee mug or a reusable bottle, avoiding takeout plastic cutlery if you're ordering takeout during the pandemic, bringing a reusable shopping bag. These all kind of make material impacts in terms of plastics use, but they also send a really strong signal to the plastics manufacturers and to policymakers that individuals really care about this issue. At the same time, we're not going to solve this problem on the back of individual choice. This is true for climate change, and it's true for plastics as well. So we really need a sort of a system-wide change in how we design, manufacture, use, and then recycle plastics. And that's why we're big fans of either state or federal legislation to get at that issue. And in particular, right now, there is a bill in Congress called the Break Free from Plastics Act, which is a complicated piece of legislation that comes at the plastic pollution problem from a variety of ways, including, banning problematic products, creating incentives for increased collection and reuse, and then greater corporate responsibility for solving the problem as well.
So, in terms of greater corporate responsibility, components of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act and other federal and state legislation are focused on extended producer responsibility. In other words, if you make a material or a product, that you're responsible to collect and recycle it. Does the Ocean Conservancy see that program, that approach, as the right way to go to require an ownership of the material and responsibility for it?
In short, yes. We are sort of fans of extended producer responsibility. We produced a policy document a year or so ago in which EPR kind of emerged as one of the most important and effective ways to get at the plastic pollution problem. The principles are strong. That is, the idea that the private sector, that the manufacturers of plastics and plastic products need to be sort of both morally, practically, and financially responsible for the full life cycle of what they're producing. And that's because there's so many externalities associated with these products, kind of after they leave the factory. So what this would do in practice is essentially create a structure by which the industries would collaborate to increase the collection of these materials, as well as create a funding mechanism through those systems for better management and design of them. So it really is a kind of a radical change in how we have typically thought about managing plastic waste, which is largely thinking about it as a waste management issue. This really gets much farther up the supply chain. But as a result, it really challenges the way the recycling industry, the waste industry, and the private sector currently interact with each other. So it is a heavy lift, but philosophically, we do think we need to move much more aggressively toward a concept of greater producer responsibility in this area.
So based on your interactions with corporate participants in Ocean Conservancy events, do you feel like that they are willing to do that voluntarily, or is it going to require a law?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. There are groups of industry members who are coming together to talk about this. At Ocean Conservancy, we have a group called the Trash-Free Seas Alliance, which is a collaborative of scientists, NGOs, and the private sector who are talking about plastic policy generally, including elements that would fit into EPR. So, for example, recycled content standards as a way to create incentives within the plastic supply chain for greater recovery. So there's a lot of movement in that regard. At the same time, there's a half a dozen states now here in the U.S. who have got together to coordinate on thinking about an integrated state approach that would be legislatively mandated. I think at the end of the day, there is going to have to be legislation, in part because I think that will bring everybody essentially to the table, but it will also level the playing field in a way that it's very difficult if you're a single actor to step out ahead of the crowd because then you perceive yourself as being at a competitive disadvantage. So we really need policy to bring everybody to the table together.
Okay, so there are leaders who are taking some steps, but to your point, in order to bring everybody to the table, we need these laws. That's thank you. That's very clear. So let me ask you about sustainable fishing now. The Ocean Conservancy is working to develop sustainable fisheries practices. What do you recommend we do to bring that to fruition?
So Ocean Conservancy has worked on overfishing issues and fishery improvements in fishery management for a long time. We've been around as an organization for about 50 years, and for probably 30 years of that, we've worked on domestic U.S. fishery policy. And if you go way back into the 70s, we set up the nation's fishing law that essentially resulted in overcapacity and overfishing. And ever since then, we've been trying to strengthen that law and make it more kind of responsible to making sure that there are enough fish in the ocean, to be self-perpetuating and provide the fish themselves and the income that a sustainable industry needs. And that work has really been successful. The Magnuson-Stevens Act now is really a model for how you can use science in a strong regulatory environment to both, essentially have your fish and eat it too. And so if consumers are looking to support sustainable fisheries, we encourage them to look toward domestic U.S. fisheries, which are some of the best regulated in the world. It can be done. Mm-hmm. There are also other good resources out there. So organizations like the Monterey Bay Aquarium produce seafood cards, which really look at the global seafood supply chain and make very detailed science-based recommendations on more and less sustainable fisheries, which really shines a bright light on a pretty opaque industry otherwise, and helps consumers make better choices.
Now, does fish farming fit into that solution?
Absolutely. We're not going to be able to feed a hungry planet on wild fish alone. Mm-hmm. And aquaculture, fish farming, now makes up about 50% of the fish that people are eating already. It's the most rapidly growing sector of the food industry. And there are a bewildering array of species and production systems. There's probably a whole hour conversation just on aquaculture. But some forms of aquaculture have a bad reputation and continue to struggle. The most obvious that folks hear about is farmed salmon, which is often grown in open net pens in coastal areas that has big concerns around the use of antibiotics, the escape of non-native species, and a variety of kind of interactions with wildlife. So farmed salmon is still a pretty tough choice, but there are lots of great choices out there in the farmed fish category, most notably shellfish. So things like mussels, clams, oysters. These don't require any external food. They clean the water through their filter feeding. And those are really great choices, both for the ocean, but also for the climate, because they have a very low carbon footprint.
Well, to your point, there are literally hours of conversation here, and you've been very generous with your time. I want to thank you for talking with us today.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Mitch. I hope it's been helpful.
How can our listeners support your work?
Well, the first thing you can do is, get interested in the oceans. Come to oceanconservancy.org. We have a plethora of information just to, become educated. You can find out about all of our different conservation programs. And of course, we would love, a contribution if people are willing to contribute. We are obviously a nonprofit. But I would say, learn more, get involved in many cases at the federal level, in your local state, sometimes at the local municipality level. There are ocean issues that are on the ballot and that are being debated, at state capitals and city councils around the country. So, find out more and become an active participant in that public process as well.
Well, thank you, George. We look forward to talking to you again.
All right. Thanks, Mitch.
Well, folks, that was George Leonard. He's the chief scientist at the Ocean Conservancy, based in Santa Cruz, California. Do check out oceanconservancy.org. And if you'd like to donate, they have an easy way to do that there at donate.oceanconservancy.org. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear, and we'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. We'll be back soon.